The air in the mansion felt thick, heavy with the scent of expensive perfume and the low, constant hum of people trying to sound important. It was the kind of party where everyone's smile was a little too bright and their laughs didn't quite reach their eyes. For her, it was just another Tuesday night. The black uniform she wore felt like a costume, marking her as an outsider in this world of shimmering dresses and sharp suits. She moved through the crowd with a tray balanced carefully in one hand, her feet aching in shoes that were supposed to be comfortable but weren't. Her job was to be invisible, to refill glasses and clear away empty plates without ever really being seen. She was a shadow in a room full of people who only cared about the light. She was a student, really. A music student. That was the secret she kept tucked away, hidden behind the polite nod and the, "Can I get you another drink, sir?" This job paid the rent, kept the lights on, and hopefully, if she got enough hours, would cover next semester's tuition. It was a trade. Her time and her energy for a chance to do what she truly loved. Sometimes, late at night in her small apartment, she would sit at her old, slightly out-of-tune upright piano and let her fingers fly. That was her world. This place, with its high ceilings and cold marble floors, was just something she had to get through. Her eyes scanned the room, not as a guest admiring the decor, but as a worker looking for empty glasses. That's when she saw it. Tucked away in a corner, like a forgotten king on a throne, was a grand piano. It was a sleek black Steinway, so polished it reflected the glittering chandeliers above like a dark mirror. It was perfect. Absolutely flawless. And it was completely silent. No one was even looking at it. It was the most expensive piece of furniture in the room, a status symbol for the man who owned the house, a man who, she had heard, couldn't play a single note. It made her feel a little sad. This beautiful instrument, capable of creating such powerful emotions, was just there. Like a painting in a room full of people who were too busy looking at their phones to actually see it, she continued her rounds. Weaving between clusters of people who talked loudly about stock markets and vacations in places she couldn't pronounce. She heard snippets of conversations that felt like they were from another planet. The IPO was a bloodbath, but we shorted it at the right time. A man in a crisp white shirt boomed, clinking his glass with another man who laughed just as loudly. A woman with diamonds around her neck complained that her private jet was being serviced, forcing her to fly commercial. The waitress just kept her head down, a small ghost flitting through their world of incredible wealth. She felt a familiar knot tighten in her stomach. It was a mix of exhaustion and a strange, hollow feeling. These people had everything, or so it seemed. They had the money, the houses, the cars. They had a piano that probably cost more than her entire life's education. But as she watched them, she didn't see much joy. She saw competition. She saw performance. She saw people trying to one-up each other with stories of success. During a brief lull, when the guests were distracted by a fresh tray of hors d'oeuvres being passed around, she found herself standing near the piano. No one was paying attention to her. For a moment, she wasn't a waitress in a stiff uniform. She was just a person who loved music. She let her fingers hover over the keys, not touching them, just feeling the cool air that surrounded them. In her head, a song started to play. It was a piece by Chopin she had been struggling with for weeks, a complicated tangle of notes that required both precision and a deep, aching feeling. Her teacher had told her, "You have the technical skill, but you need to play it with your heart. You need to let it break a little." Her right hand, resting on her thigh, began to move. Her fingers, long and slender, traced the pattern of the music on the rough fabric of her uniform. She was playing the song in her mind, imagining the weight of the keys, the way the sound would fill the room if she dared to press down. It was her secret escape, a way to transport herself from this gilded cage to a place where things felt real and true. The music in her head was so clear, so full of passion and sorrow, that for a second she forgot where she was. She forgot the aching feet, the fake smiles, the heavy tray. She was just a musician, and the piano was her friend. She was so lost in the melody that she didn't notice the man who had stopped talking. She didn't see the way his head tilted, his eyes narrowing as he focused on the quiet girl standing by his silent piano. She didn't see the predatory smile that slowly spread across his face. She was still in her own world, a world that was about to come crashing down around her. The music in her head was a warm, safe blanket, a world she had built for herself out of melody and memory. In that world, she was not a waitress in a borrowed uniform. She was an artist, her fingers dancing across ivory keys, creating beauty out of silence. But the real world has a way of breaking in, and it did so with a voice that was as sharp and cold as a shard of glass. Well, what do we have here? The voice sliced through her concentration, and the music in her mind shattered into 1,000 pieces. She flinched, pulling her hand back from her thigh as if she'd been burned. Her head snapped up, and her eyes met those of the man who owned the house, the man who owned the piano, the man who, for a few hours a night, owned her time. He was standing much closer than she realized, a predatory smile playing on his lips. He had the kind of face that was handsome in a cold, sculpted way, but his eyes held no warmth. They were small, dark, and calculating, like a shark's circling its prey. He had seen her. He had heard her silent song. A wave of hot, prickly shame washed over her, starting in her chest and spreading to the tips of her ears. She had been caught. Not doing anything wrong, but doing something personal, something sacred. It felt like he had walked into her small apartment and started reading her diary. Her first instinct was to apologize, to shrink away, to become the invisible waitress again. "I'm so sorry, sir," she stammered, her voice barely a whisper. I'll get back to work." She clutched the empty tray in her hand like a shield, ready to make a quick escape back to the safety of the kitchen. But he didn't move. In fact, he seemed to enjoy her discomfort. His smile widened, revealing teeth that were too white, too perfect. He took a deliberate step forward, blocking her path. "Oh, no need for that," he said, his voice loud enough to carry over the low hum of the party. He gestured with a lazy, almost contemptuous wave of his hand towards the grand piano. "You seem to know the tune? Why don't you play for us?" The words hung in the air, heavy and poisonous. A few heads nearby turned. A small group of guests, who had been discussing something boring and important, now had a new source of entertainment. Her, the waitress. The spectacle. Her blood ran cold. Play for them? On this piano? In front of these people? The idea was so terrifying, so absurd that she almost laughed. But the look on his face told her he was not joking. This was a game to him, a little piece of theater he had decided to produce, and she was the unwilling star. "Oh, no, sir. I couldn't," she said, shaking her head, her eyes wide with pleading. I'm just a waitress. I don't play well." It was a lie, but it was the only defense she had. If she admitted she could play, she would be expected to be good. And to be good in front of this crowd, to be judged by them, was a fate worse than simply being fired. The millionaire's smile vanished, replaced by a cold, hard authority that was far more frightening than his predatory grin. The shift was instantaneous, like a switch being flipped. The charming host was gone, and the powerful, ruthless man was standing in his place. "I wasn't asking," he said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous rumble. He took another step closer, invading her personal space, forcing her to tilt her head back to look at him. "I am paying you to be here, and I am telling you to play. Or you can leave and find out how difficult I can make your life." The threat was not shouted. It was delivered with a quiet, chilling confidence that made it all the more real. It wasn't just about losing this one job. She knew men like him. They had connections. They owned restaurants, catering companies, event spaces. He could make a single phone call and ensure she never worked in this town again. He could make her life a living hell, all because she refused to be his performing monkey. By now, a larger crowd had gathered. The whispers spread like wildfire through the room, and more people drifted over, drawn by the promise of conflict. They formed a loose circle around the piano, around her and the man who held her fate in his hands. She scanned their faces, searching for a flicker of sympathy, for someone who might step in and stop this. But she found none. She saw pity in a few eyes, but it was a distant, detached pity, the kind one feels for a character in a movie. Mostly, she saw cruel anticipation. These people were bored. They had heard all the stock market stories and vacation boasts they could handle for one night. This was something new. This was a live show. They were expecting a train wreck, a cheap, humiliating spectacle for their amusement. They wanted to see the waitress, the help, make a fool of herself on the millionaire's expensive toy. A woman in a silver dress raised her phone not to call for help, but to record. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, trapped bird beating against a cage. Her palms were slick with sweat, and she could feel a tremor starting in her hands. She looked from the cold, unyielding face of the man to the sea of expectant, judgmental faces of the crowd. There was no way out. To refuse was to risk everything she had worked for. To accept was to risk the one thing that truly mattered to her, her music. Her passion. Her soul. He was asking her to lay it bare, to let these vultures pick at it for their entertainment. The choice was no choice at all. Defeated, she gave a tiny, almost imperceptible nod. The man's smile returned, triumphant and cruel. He stepped back and swept his arm towards the piano in a grand, theatrical gesture. "After you," he said, as if he were doing her a great honor. She walked the few steps to the piano as if she were walking to her own execution. Each step felt heavy, her feet sinking into the thick carpet as if it were quicksand. The room was silent now. The only sound, the soft click of her shoes on the marble floor around the piano and the distant thumping of her own blood in her ears. She could feel every eye on her, boring into her back. She reached the bench and hesitated, her hand hovering over the polished wood. It felt cold to the touch. She slowly lowered herself onto the bench, the plush velvet doing nothing to comfort her. She was an island in a sea of sharks. In front of her, the 88 black and white keys gleamed under the chandelier light. They looked like a cliff's edge, and she was about to jump. She placed her trembling fingers on the keys, the cool ivory a small shock against her feverish skin. The guests leaned in, their hungry silence waiting for her to fail. She sat on the bench, the plush velvet a soft cushion against the hard reality of her situation. In front of her, the 88 black and white keys stared back, a silent jury waiting to pass judgment. The air in the room felt thick, heavy with the weight of dozens of stares. She could feel them on her neck, on her hands, on her back. They were not looks of encouragement. They were the cold, curious gazes of people waiting for a crash. Her fingers, which just moments ago had danced with silent grace on her thigh, now felt like foreign objects, clumsy and cold. A tremor ran through her hand, and she quickly pulled it back, clutching it in her lap. She took a deep, shaky breath, trying to find a center of calm in the storm of her fear. She knew she had to play something. The silence was stretching, becoming more and more oppressive. The millionaire stood with his arms crossed, his expression a mask of smug satisfaction. He was enjoying this, her terror. He was feeding on it. She thought of the threat he had made, the quiet, venomous way he had promised to ruin her life. She had no choice. With a sense of dread that settled like a stone in her stomach, she placed her fingers back on the keys. They were slick with sweat. She decided to play the piece she had been humming, the Chopin Etude. It was familiar, a friend in a room full of enemies. She pressed down. The first few notes stumbled out, hesitant and weak like a child learning to walk. They were slightly off-key, the timing clumsy. A few smirks appeared in the crowd. A woman in a tight-fitting dress let out a small, sharp laugh, quickly covering her mouth with her hand. The millionaire's smile widened. He looked like a cat that had just caught a mouse. This was exactly what he had wanted. This was the humiliation he had paid for. The woman with the phone angled her device, making sure to get a clear shot of the waitress's flushed, panicked face. Each mistake she made was another nail in the coffin of her dignity, another piece of entertainment for these people who had so little of their own. Her heart sank. This was a disaster. She was proving them right. She was just a waitress, a pretender who had no business sitting at a real piano. She wanted to stop, to stand up, to run out of the room and never look back. but his threat held her in place. She was trapped. She continued to play, her fingers fumbling over the keys. The beautiful melody of the Chopin piece twisted into a clumsy, unrecognizable mess. She could feel tears welling up behind her eyes, hot and stinging. She fought them back, blinking rapidly. She would not cry. She would not give them that satisfaction. Then something inside her shifted. A small, defiant spark flickered to life. Maybe it was anger. Maybe it was pride. Maybe it was just the sheer refusal to let them break her. She thought of her teacher's words, "You need to play it with your heart. You need to let it break a little." Right now, her heart was breaking. So maybe that was exactly what she needed. She closed her eyes. It was a simple act, but it changed everything. By closing her eyes, she shut them out. She shut out the smirking faces, the predatory stare of the millionaire, the cold lens of the phone camera. The room, with its glittering chandeliers and cold marble floors, faded away. She was no longer a waitress on display in a rich man's mansion. She was back in her small, cluttered apartment. She could almost smell the old books on her shelves and the faint scent of coffee from the morning. She could feel the worn, familiar keys of her own upright piano beneath her fingers. She was alone with the music, just the way she liked it, and the music began to breathe. The change was subtle at first. The hesitant notes became a little more confident. The timing smoothed out. The melody, which had been a fragile, stumbling thread, began to strengthen, to weave itself into something recognizable. Her fingers, which had been stiff with fear, began to relax. They remembered the patterns, the muscle memory taking over from her panicked mind. She was no longer thinking about what to play. She was just playing. She was letting the music flow through her, a current of emotion and sound. The guests noticed the change. The smirks began to fade, replaced by looks of confusion. The whispers died down. The woman with the phone slowly lowered it, her expression shifting from cruel amusement to rapt attention. The music was no longer just a collection of notes. It was telling a story. It was a story of struggle, of sorrow, but also of a growing strength. The simple, hesitant tune was transforming into a cascade of powerful, emotional chords. It was the storm her teacher had talked about, and it was just beginning to break. Her posture changed. Her back, once slumped in defeat, straightened. Her shoulders relaxed. She leaned into the piano, her body moving with the music. Her fingers, which had once trembled, now flew across the keys with a speed and grace that seemed impossible. They were no longer clumsy. They were possessed. They danced, they leaped, they wept across the ivory. The sound swelled, filling every corner of the vast room, washing over the silent crowd. It was a sound so full of passion and pain and beauty that it felt alive. It was a force of nature, and she was its conduit. The room was now completely silent, but it was a different kind of silence. It was not the empty, hungry silence of anticipation. It was a full, heavy, reverent silence. No one was moving. No one was thinking about their stocks or their vacations or their social status. They were captivated. They were transported. They had come to witness a humiliation, but they were now witnessing something far more rare and profound, the raw, unfiltered power of true talent. A man who had been yawning behind his hand now sat bolt upright, his eyes wide. A couple who had been whispering to each other now stood with their mouths slightly agape, their forgotten drinks held loosely in their hands. The only person who was not captivated was the millionaire. His face was a thundercloud of fury. The spectacle was happening, but not in the way he had orchestrated. He had wanted a puppet to humiliate, but he had unleashed a force of nature. The center of attention had shifted from him to the music, to the waitress. He was no longer the powerful master of the house. He was just another member of the audience, dwarfed by a talent he could never buy or control. His power in this room had evaporated, replaced by the immense, undeniable power of her art. He stood there, his arms crossed so tightly his knuckles were white. His face a mask of impotent rage. She played on, lost in the storm of the music. The final, powerful chords built, one after another, a wave of sound rising higher and higher, threatening to crash over the entire room. And then it did. She brought her hands down on the keys in a thunderous, final chord that seemed to shake the very foundations of the mansion. The sound was immense, a declaration of strength and survival. It hung in the air, vibrating, echoing, a final, defiant statement. And then, as the last resonance faded into a profound and absolute silence, she opened her eyes. The final, powerful chord seemed to suck all the air out of the room. It was a sound so big, so full of emotion, that it left a void in its wake. For a moment that stretched into what felt like an eternity, there was nothing. No sound, no movement. The vibrations from the piano strings faded, leaving a profound and heavy silence that pressed down on everyone. It was the kind of silence that was louder than any noise, a shared, collective moment of being completely and utterly stunned. The waitress sat frozen, her fingers still resting on the keys, her body rigid. The storm had passed, and she was left in the strange, quiet calm that followed. Her chest was heaving, each breath a ragged pull. She was slowly coming back to herself. The fog of adrenaline and music beginning to clear. The reality of where she was, of what she had just done, started to creep back in. The smirks were gone. Every single one of them. The cruel, anticipatory smiles that had been on the faces of the guests just minutes before had vanished, wiped away by the sheer force of what they had just witnessed. In their place was a look of pure, unadulterated awe. Their eyes were wide, their mouths slightly agape. They weren't just impressed, they were moved. They had come expecting a spectacle, a cheap form of entertainment rooted in humiliation. Instead, they had been given a gift, a raw and beautiful glimpse into a soul they hadn't known existed. A woman who had been whispering cruelly to her friend now just stood there, her hand covering her mouth, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. The man who had been yawning behind his hand was now leaning forward, his forgotten glass of champagne tilting precariously in his grip, his entire being focused on the young woman at the piano. The silence was finally broken by a single sound. It came from the back of the room near a large potted fern. An older man, with a neatly trimmed white beard and a distinguished air, slowly raised his hands and began to clap. It wasn't the polite, obligatory clapping one gives after a performance at a party. It was a slow, deliberate, and resonant clap. Each clap was a separate, distinct sound, full of weight and meaning. Clap, clap, clap. It was the clap of a connoisseur, a master craftsman recognizing a masterpiece. It was the clap of someone who understood the difficulty, the passion, and the sheer artistry of what had just transpired. This man, a retired conductor who had heard the world's greatest musicians in the world's most famous concert halls, was not just being polite, he was showing respect. Genuine, heartfelt respect. His solitary applause acted as a catalyst. It gave everyone else in the room permission to react. A few others joined in, their claps at first hesitant, then growing more confident. The sound began to spread, rippling through the crowd like a wave moving across the surface of a still pond. Soon, the entire room was filled with the sound of applause. It wasn't just a polite patter. It grew into a thunderous, deafening roar of appreciation. It was a wave of sound so powerful it seemed to physically push against her. It was the sound of 100 people, all of whom had been prepared to judge her, now celebrating her. The sound was what finally pulled her out of her daze. She opened her eyes, which she hadn't realized she had squeezed shut. The wall of sound hit her, and she flinched, startled. She looked out at the sea of faces, but they were different now. The judgment, the cruelty, the boredom, it was all gone. All she saw was a sea of smiling, appreciative faces. Some people were even standing up, their hands held high as they clapped. A standing ovation for her, the waitress, the girl who was just trying to make it through her shift. She felt a wave of heat wash over her face, a blush of pure, overwhelming emotion. She didn't know what to do. She wasn't a performer. She didn't know how to take a bow. She just sat there, her hands still on the keys, and gave a small, awkward nod. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with a mixture of shock, relief, and a profound, bone-deep exhaustion. In the middle of this storm of applause, one figure stood frozen, a statue of fury, the millionaire. His face was no longer a mask of smug satisfaction. It was a twisted, ugly mask of pure, unadulterated rage. His plan had not just backfired, it had exploded in his face. He had wanted to break her, to humiliate her, to use her as a prop to demonstrate his own power. Instead, he had given her a stage and she had used it to utterly eclipse him. The spectacle had happened, but he was not the one in control. He was not the star of the show. He was just another member of the audience, watching helplessly as the person he had sought to destroy became the hero of the story. His power in the room had evaporated, completely and utterly replaced by the raw, undeniable power of her talent. He couldn't stop the applause. He couldn't shout over it. He couldn't order these people, his peers, his admirers, to stop celebrating this waitress. In this moment, his money, his influence, his entire persona meant nothing. The only thing that mattered was the music, and it had come from her. His jaw was clenched so tightly that a muscle twitched in his cheek. His hands, which had been casually crossed, were now balled into fists at his sides, his knuckles white. He had been upstaged, not by a rival businessman or a socialite, but by the one person in the room he had considered beneath his notice. He had been defeated by a song, and the defeat was absolute. The unraveling of his carefully constructed evening and his own sense of superiority was complete. The thunderous applause began to soften, like a heavy rain turning into a gentle shower. The sound didn't just stop. It faded into a warm, humming energy that filled the space between the people. The waitress remained on the piano bench, her hands now resting in her lap. She felt disconnected from her body, as if she were watching this whole scene unfold from somewhere up near the ceiling. The faces in the crowd were no longer a blur of judgment. They were individual, expressive, and filled with a kindness she hadn't expected. A few people were still clapping, and a woman in the front row dabbed at her eyes with a silk handkerchief. Slowly, hesitantly, people began to move towards her. They weren't approaching a waitress to ask for a drink. They were approaching an artist to offer their praise. A man in a tailored suit extended his hand, not for a handshake, but just to show his respect. That was incredible, he said, his voice filled with genuine wonder. Truly incredible. A younger woman, not much older than herself, gushed, "I've never felt anything like that. Where did you learn to play?" The questions came from all sides, a gentle tide of admiration washing over her. "Who is your teacher? Have you ever performed professionally?" That piece, it was like you were telling us your life story. She was overwhelmed. She didn't know how to answer. Her teacher was a kind but strict old lady at the local community center. She had never performed for anyone other than her classmates and her family. And as for telling her life story, she supposed in a way she had. She just shook her head, offering a small, tired smile. "Thank you," she managed to say, her voice barely a whisper. "Thank you all." She felt like an imposter. These people, with their expensive clothes and their easy lives, were praising her for something that came from a place of struggle and desperation, a place they could never understand. This new, fragile dynamic was shattered by a voice that cut through the warm atmosphere like a shard of ice. "That's enough." The crowd parted, and the millionaire strode through the opening he created. His face was a contorted mask of fury, his complexion a dangerous shade of purple. The polite facade was completely gone, replaced by a raw, undisciplined rage that made him look smaller, almost pathetic. He ignored the guests, his eyes locked onto the waitress still sitting at his piano. He couldn't stand to see her there. Bathed in the admiration he so desperately craved for himself, he stopped directly in front of her, his shadow falling over her. "You," he snarled, his voice low and venomous, a sharp contrast to the applause that had just filled the room. "You're done for the night. Get your things and get out of my house." The words were meant to be a final, crushing blow, a way to reclaim his power in the only way he could. He was firing her. He was putting her back in her place, but the power of his words had evaporated. The guests looked at him, not with fear or respect, but with a mixture of pity and disgust. He just looked like a spoiled child who had lost his favorite toy. The waitress, however, felt a wave of pure, unadulterated relief. He was firing her. It was over. She didn't have to be here anymore. She didn't have to pretend to be invisible or endure their judgment. She could just leave. A sense of freedom, light and airy, filled her chest. She didn't flinch. She didn't argue. She simply looked up at him, her expression calm and clear. Without a word, she gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. She slowly rose from the piano bench, her movements steady and deliberate. She turned her back on him without a second glance and walked away from the piano, leaving the king of the house alone with his silent, conquered trophy. She walked through the crowd, which now parted for her as if she were royalty. They watched her go with a new kind of respect. She was no longer the humiliated waitress. She was the artist who had walked away from the tyrant. She made her way towards the small hallway that led to the kitchen where she had left her bag. The sounds of the party seemed to fade behind her, replaced by the quiet padding of her own footsteps on the marble floor. She felt a profound sense of peace settle over her. The ordeal was over. She had survived. Just as she reached for the door to the service area, a gentle voice stopped her. "Young lady." She turned to see the older man, the one who had started the applause. He had a kind face with deep-set eyes that seemed to hold a lifetime of wisdom. He wasn't looking at her with pity or with the morbid curiosity of the other guests. He was looking at her with the quiet, steady gaze of a fellow artist. "That was truly exceptional," he said, his voice soft but firm. "Exceptional is not a word I use lightly." She felt a blush rise to her cheeks. "Thank you," she said, her voice still a little shaky. I had to." The old man smiled, a warm, genuine smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes. "I understand. Sometimes the most powerful art comes from the most difficult circumstances." He paused, studying her face. "You have a rare gift. A combination of technical skill and deep, raw emotion. That's not something you can teach. That's something you're born with." He reached into the inner pocket of his jacket and pulled out a simple, cream-colored business card. He held it out to her. "I have a colleague," he continued, "a wonderful woman who runs the summer program at one of the most prestigious music schools in the country. I want you to call her tomorrow. Mention my name." She took the card, her fingers trembling slightly. It felt heavy in her hand, heavier than it should have. It felt like a lifeline. On it, there was just a name and a phone number. It was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. I don't know what to say," she stammered, her eyes welling up with tears for the second time that night. But these were not tears of shame. They were tears of gratitude, of hope. "Don't say anything," the man said gently. "Just play. Keep playing." He gave her a small, reassuring nod, then turned and walked back towards the party. Leaving her alone in the hallway with the card in her hand, she pushed open the door to the kitchen, retrieved her worn canvas bag from a small locker, and slipped out of the stiff, black uniform, pulling on her own comfortable jeans and a simple t-shirt. She felt like she was shedding a skin. She walked through the back entrance of the mansion and out into the cool night air. The city lights twinkled in the distance, a galaxy of possibilities. She looked down at the card in her hand, the name and number stark against the cream background. She was no longer just a waitress heading home to a small apartment after a long shift. She was a musician, and this was her unexpected debut. The forced performance, the public humiliation, the Millionaire's rage had all been a nightmare. But from the ashes of that nightmare, a new beginning was rising. And for the first time in a very long time, she felt truly, unshakably free.